Last time we talked about physical and cognitive developments. Today we'll talk about social and emotional developments. So we'll start, as usual, with Erikson's psychosocial stage, and you'll see that in adolescence, one of the main focuses is on kind of discovering an identity, trying to figure out who you are, who you want to be. That's pretty important for then making decisions about like career paths and going to school and things like that. In addition, we'll talk about how the social life of a teenager often shifts to much more focus on friendships and romantic relationships. I mean, that's kind of been gradually happening even throughout like middle childhood. Friendships start to become more important than family relationships, but that continues and gets even more, more so during adolescence, where really a lot of the focus is on friendships and romantic relationships. And then we'll end by talking a little bit about moods and emotions. I will also kind of give you a little bit of trigger warning that towards the end we'll talk very briefly about like suicide rates and things like that in adolescence. We won't go into a lot of detail, no gory details or anything, but I'll just talk kind of briefly about, how common suicide is. So I know that can be difficult to hear for some people. Okay, so to start, like I said, Erikson's psychosocial stage. So we're in I think like the 5th stage at this point of Erikson's 8 stages. So during adolescence, the primary focus is on finding an identity versus role confusion would be kind of the negative outcome of this crisis. So identity is about finding out basically who you are in every way imaginable. So trying to decide what your values are. This could be like political beliefs, religious beliefs, family values, societal values, what direction you want to take in life. So are you going to pursue college? Are you going to go straight into an occupation? Are you going to take a year off and backpack across Europe? Trying to kind of make that decision about what you want to do, what you want to be when you grow up. Figuring out sexual orientation and gender identity. We talked a little bit about that last time with like the puberty blockers. That also becomes really important. Trying to figure out what like ethnic group you fit into, especially if you come from like a mixed race background, can be a challenge. So, I could list probably like 100 more things here, but it's all about just figuring out who are you and who do you want to continue to be. Adolescents who end up on that side, they get kind of a healthy sense, they explore a lot, and they commit to identities that they are happy with and that will serve kind of a good purpose for the rest of their life. If, on the other hand, they are not given the opportunity to explore, then they may end up on the side of role confusion. So adolescents who end up on that side, they may have kind of a lack of direction. They may flounder and not really know what they want to do. Not that you should know, not like if all of you, again, pretty much are in adolescence or coming just right out of it, and you might not know what you want to do with your life. That's completely fine. But, role confusion is basically like a complete lack of direction, have no clue what they want to do. Lack of self-definition, they may lack values, or their values may change depending on who they're around, who they're hanging out with. So they tend to be less prepared for adulthood. And again, this often happens due to restriction of choices, either from parents or other authority figures. So just to kind of elaborate a little bit, this table sort of lays out these 4 possible sort of stages of finding an identity. And first of all, let me just say that each of these stages, like you can move through them in different orders. You kind of go back and forth between one stage and another. And you could be at any of these stages for just about any type of identity like I just talked about. So maybe you've really figured out solidly what like your religious beliefs are, but you're not really sure about your political beliefs. Maybe you know what music you like, but you're not really sure what hobbies you like. So it's not like a person is ever in just one of these quadrants at any given time. They could be in multiple ones. But the idea here is that we have kind of different levels of what's called exploration and commitment. So exploration is where, as it implies, like you're exploring different identities. So maybe you're exploring lots of different career paths. Maybe you're researching, what jobs require what degree and how much money you're going to make at all these different jobs. Maybe you're shadowing people. Maybe you're going to your parents' work and seeing what they do. So that would be all exploration. You're trying to just kind of see what your options are and just kind of explore them, basically. Commitment is then making a decision of deciding this is the identity I'm going to take, this is the job I'm going to take, this is the religion I'm going to subscribe to, this is the political party I'm going to subscribe to, and sticking with that. So depending on the level of exploration or commitment, you're going to end up in one of these 4 different quadrants. So identity achievement is where you have had lots of chance to explore all the opportunities, or at least lots of opportunities, but you've found one that fits you and you've settled, and now you're highly committed to that and you're going to stick with it for a long period of time. And typically that's kind of where you want to eventually end up. You want to eventually end up in the quadrant of high identity achievement, again, where you've had lots of chance to explore, but you've settled on something that seems to fit you that you can commit to. I would say maybe the second best place to be would be what's called identity moratorium. So that's when you're still in that exploration phase, but you haven't committed to anything yet. So you're getting lots of opportunities. Maybe you're joining lots of clubs. You're hanging out with lots of different friends. You're listening to lots of different music, etc. So you're exploring all your options, but you haven't necessarily committed to a particular identity yet. Then that would be identity moratorium. And then some less favorable outcomes are listed at the bottom, identity foreclosure and identity diffusion. So identity foreclosure happens whenever a person has not had a lot of chance to explore, but they go ahead and commit to something anyways. So often this can happen if a person is pressured by like their parents or their teachers. So maybe you have a parent who was a doctor or is a doctor, and they really want you to be a doctor too, so they pressure you into that path. And you don't even take the time to explore other career options because your parents have basically made the decision for you. And then you end up committing to this career path before you've really had a chance to see if it's going to fit you. That would be called identity foreclosure. And then identity diffusion is where you're low in both. So you're not really taking any time to explore opportunities. You're also not committing to anything. You're kind of just in this like limbo state of staying sort of content, status quo, not exploring, not making any growth, but also not committing to anything either. And again, just to reiterate, you could be at any of those quadrants for any of your particular identities. So again, you might have achieved your career path and be in identity achievement for that, but you might be in identity moratorium for something else, for your religious beliefs or whatever. Let's see. People who end up in identity achievement and moratorium tend to have higher senses of like self-esteem and autonomy. They feel more in control of their lives, which makes a lot of sense, I think. Those who end up in foreclosure, so again, that's where you've committed to something too early, you haven't really like explored all the options, tend to have a really like inflexible way of seeing the world. So they tend to see the world in really like black and white. And they usually are internalizing other people's beliefs and values. So instead of taking the time to figure out who they are themselves, they're taking maybe their parents' beliefs or their peers' beliefs, and they're just internalizing all of those and committing to them too quickly. And they usually are dependent on other people for like their sense of self or their self-esteem. Again, those are people in the identity foreclosure. Those who end up in identity diffusion usually they're not very good at dealing with like making choices. They can be very indecisive. They won't settle on anything really. They tend to have lower self-esteem overall, and they're more prone to like depression and other mood disorders. So given all this, I would say high school and like early college is probably, one of the most important things you can be doing is exploring all of your options for, again, any type of identity you can think of, trying to learn as much as you can about other people's religious beliefs, other people's political beliefs, trying to, like I said, get involved in clubs, try all kinds of different hobbies, because that's really the time that it's important to find your thing and find, what you're going to commit to for potentially the rest of your life, or at least for a very long amount of time. Okay, so finding an identity is one of the most important things happening during this time. There are also, again, developments in moral understanding, as we've seen throughout, all of childhood, getting into adolescence, those moral understandings continue to develop. This table I have here is from a theorist named Kohlberg, who came out with this idea of like we have these different levels of moral understanding. And the idea is that most people kind of mature through these levels somewhat in an order. And we've kind of alluded to this in like, when I've talked about moral understanding in childhood, I talked about how children tend to be very like black and white. They see things as either right or wrong. There's not a lot of nuance or context. This kind of follows that same logic that I've talked about before. So the pre-conventional level of moral understanding, according to this theory, basically says that people in that level tend to focus mostly on punishment in obedience and what's called instrumental purpose. So they're really fixated on, like I said, kind of that black and white, and if someone does something wrong, they need to be punished. I should back up too and say that Kohlberg, when he was developing this, the way that he kind of got to his conclusions is he would make these moral dilemmas where there's like a scenario he describes where you have to choose between different sets of values, and based on the reasoning that the person gives for their kind of choice of the outcome of this scenario, they would be placed at one of these different levels. So just as an example, like here's one of the dilemmas that he would put to people for them to try to work through. So in this dilemma, he said, a woman is dying from cancer. Doctors have created a drug that will for sure cure her and save her life, but they've made it 10 times the price of what it would cost to actually produce it. So they're making like a huge profit off of this drug. So the sick woman's husband does everything he can to try to get the money for this drug. He like asks everyone that he knows if he can borrow money. He works extra shifts at work. He tries to sell like anything they have of value, etc. But that's still not enough. So then he tries negotiating with the doctors to get them to bring the price down, and they won't. So eventually what he does is he breaks into the hospital and steals the drug himself. So he goes to the pharmacist, takes the drug, gives it to his wife, and she's cured. So he poses a dilemma like that, and then he asks people basically like, do you think he should be punished? Do you think what he did is wrong? Why or why not? And he doesn't necessarily care too much about like the answer that they give. Someone might say, yes, he should be punished. No, he shouldn't. What he cares more about is their reasoning. So he'll ask them to kind of dig deep and think through like why they think he should be punished or not be punished and what the appropriate punishment would be. And then kind of based on their reasoning, he can place them at these different stages. So someone in stage 1 or 2 would pretty much directly say like, yes, this person should definitely be punished. They broke a law. Laws are black and white. And so if someone breaks the law, we should punish them. The main difference between stage 1 and stage 2, people at stage 2 have a really hard time considering multiple points of view. So they're only going to take one point of view into consideration, and they'll rigidly stick to that point of view. Someone in stage 2 can kind of consider multiple perspectives, but they believe that people make choices purely based on self-interest. So someone in stage 2 would have a belief that like no one is really selfless, that every choice we make is for ourselves. So they might say, the husband should be punished because he only did this so that he could have his wife, so that, she could like be with him and take care of him or whatever. So he did it for selfish reasons, so he should be punished, for example. Those in stage 3 and 4 are in the conventional level. So according to Goldberg, anyone who reaches stage 3 or 4 would be like emotionally and morally mature. So he would say that's kind of like a normal standard that most people meet. Even by adulthood, we maybe only get to like stage 3 or 4 of this moral reasoning. So stage 3 is basically kind of like using the golden rule, like treat other people like you would want to be treated. So in that case, like someone, it's hard to say exactly what answer people would give, but someone in stage 3 might say like, it's okay that he stole the drug because like she should get the drug so that she can survive. So they would like be on the side of the husband, that they probably wouldn't give a very deep, thorough explanation of what their reasoning is. Stage 4, people in stage 4 are mostly concerned about maintaining social order. So they might say something like, the husband should be punished because if he's not punished for breaking a law, then everyone is just going to start breaking laws because they know there's no punishment, so we should punish him to maintain like social order, basically. So then post-conventional and principled level, these are like the highest levels of moral understanding, but according to Kohlberg, most people don't get to those levels. And even if they are capable of getting to those levels, they don't reason at that level very often. So someone might have the capacity to reason at stage 5 and 6, but most of the time we're gonna be, strapped for time when we're making decisions, or we're not gonna operate at our full capacity. So most of the time most people are kind of operating at stage 3 and 4. But stage 5 basically says that rules should exist for a purpose. They should have an outcome that is equitable and that is helpful to as many people as possible. And if rules and laws are set up that way, then people are probably going to follow them even without really punishment or being coerced to follow them. So they would say that basically we need to restructure the system so that the situation we were faced with doesn't happen to begin with. So we never have a case where someone has to pay 10 times what a drug is worth in order to be cured of cancer, or a husband has to resort to stealing. So they would reason through more of the nuance and the context of things. And at stage 6, they're able to differentiate between universal morals and personal morals. So universal morals are basically laws and rules that we all agree that we should follow most of the time. We probably all agree we shouldn't just go around murdering people, for example. That's a universal moral. But people also have their own personal morals that are separate from that, and that laws should only enforce the universal morals, and that personal morals should be enforced by the individual who's making those choices instead of being enforced by laws or governments. So all this is to say that most adolescents can reach about stage 3 or 4. That's kind of where we end up in moral understanding for the most part. And then, like I said, that's for most people, according to Kohlberg, at least from doing these studies with these moral dilemmas and things, that seems to be the level that most people reach. And stage 5 and 6 is really only reached by exceptional individuals in very rare circumstances. Make sure I didn't skip anything in my notes on that. Okay, so now shifting a little bit to some of the social dynamics that's happening in adolescence. So as I've mentioned multiple times now, during teenage years, there tends to be quite a shift away from worrying about parent and family relationships and focusing much more on friendships and romantic partners. So during adolescence, the teenager is really going to make strong strives for autonomy. They're going to try to get as much control of their own lives as they possibly can. And that can lead to a lot of conflict between parents and adolescents. But there's quite a bit of research that suggests that conflict is actually very healthy and is a good thing. So conflict between parents and adolescents, first of all, it just teaches the adolescent how to handle conflict, because conflict is something they're going to face as they go out into college and jobs and the quote-unquote real world, the adult world. So having some practice managing that conflict with parents can help them develop, good coping skills, develop healthy boundaries, develop how to communicate those boundaries. But it also kind of creates this tension where the adolescent now sort of needs to leave the house and go do their own thing. So kind of the idea is that if you didn't have this conflict, if there was just, this really harmonious relationship between parents and their teenage children, then those children would probably just stay living with their parents forever, and wouldn't necessarily go do their own thing. So this conflict kind of drives the adolescent to find their own path in a lot of ways. In addition to striving for more autonomy, the adolescent also starts to de-idealize their parent. So a lot of children through early and middle childhood, they tend to think of their parents as kind of perfect superheroes who can do no wrong. They look up to them as these idealized figures. During adolescence is where a lot of people start to figure out that their parents are people just like them. They make mistakes. They're not perfect. And that they start to kind of de-idealize them a little bit. There is research that suggests that in order to have the most harmonious relationship you can between a teenager and a parent, you really need to focus on the quality of time spent together and not quantity of time spent together. So some parents, their reaction to this whole situation, they may react okay, my adolescent is pulling away from me. They're, starting to have more conflict. They're spending more time with their friends. So I'm going to force them to stay at home and eat dinner with me every night, and et cetera, et cetera. But it's been shown that really it's the quality of time that matters and not quantity. So typically you'll have better outcomes if the parent and the child are spending time together doing just like leisure activities, doing things that they both enjoy together if they can find that. And again, emphasizing quality and not quantity. So not just trying to spend tons of time together, but really valuing the time that they do have. Let's see. So really effective parenting during this time is just balancing sort of the connection that you've been building up for an entire lifetime at this point with the adolescent, and then the separation that's now happening as they focus more on their friends and focus on building their own identity. So good parents, authoritative parents are better at balancing that, kind of giving the teenager control slowly, but also monitoring them to make sure that, the risky behaviors we talked about last time don't get out of control. So giving them trust and autonomy, but monitoring enough that things don't, go to an extreme. Okay. So as the adolescent pulls away from their parents and their family relationships, they tend to value their friendships even more. One of the changes that happens is that typically in adolescence, their friend group grows kind of smaller and more tight-knit. So typically through early and middle childhood, friend groups are kind of growing in size. You're getting really large friend groups in some cases. And then in like these teenage high school years, that friend group shrinks but becomes much more tight-knit. So in friendships, they now are more valuing things like intimacy, sharing secrets, being vulnerable with each other, mutual understanding, so having like common goals, common values, and also loyalty as well. Friendships tend to be the most important source of social support for adolescents. So anytime they're struggling, having issues, they're often going to turn to their friends rather than their parents or their siblings or even their romantic partners. Their friendships are going to be the most important. Friends during this time tend to be similar in a lot of ways. So people tend to pick friends that are similar to them in like socioeconomic status, ethnicity, educational aspirations, political beliefs. All those identity things I talked about earlier are kind of emphasized or, I'm struggling to think of the word. There's like a word I'm thinking of and it just like blanked from my brain. But those identity issues are basically helped by the friend group, right? So the friends often will share those identities and they will kind of police each other's identities to some extent. Maybe call out or make fun of someone if they're not fitting kind of the clique that they're part of. What else? There tend to be some gender differences in the kinds of activities that friends participate in. The other thing, too, is that during this time, friendships can be more like cross-gender. So through like early and middle childhood, most friend groups are same gender. So boys are friends with boys, girls are friends with girls for the most part. But in adolescence, they become more mixed. But whenever they are in kind of their same gender groups, they tend to have specific activities. So boys are more likely to engage in like activities together, playing video games, doing a sport, things like that. Whereas girls are more likely to spend their time just like talking, basically like hanging out in a shared location and just talking, sharing stories, sharing, emotional things. There are a ton of benefits to friendships, probably not surprising. So, it's opportunities to explore those different identities I've talked about, opportunities to understand other people and their perspectives. It's a good foundation to kind of build on for intimate relationships in the future. It teaches us all kinds of important social skills. But there are also risks that come from friendships as well. Friends often will, encourage each other to engage in a lot of those risky behaviors that we've talked about. Things like sex and drugs and, car accidents and stuff often are instigated by friendships and those kind of like peer pressure behaviors. You guys probably know all of this because you're living it every day, so I always feel silly doing this part, telling you guys all about yourselves, basically. You know all this. The other important relationships that start to emerge during adolescence are romantic relationships. So people might have had their first, boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever in middle childhood, but typically those middle childhood romantic relationships are very shallow, and they're often kind of like status-based. It's almost just like, I'm cool because I have a girlfriend or boyfriend, but oftentimes girlfriends and boyfriends in that middle childhood don't even necessarily spend a lot of time together. It's more just kind of like a title or a status that they have. So adolescence is where you start to get some of the first true romantic relationships where you're engaging with someone in sort of this intimate romantic way. So in adolescence, these relationships are motivated more by intimacy. So again, that's like sharing secrets, being vulnerable with another person, showing people a side of yourself that maybe other people don't often get to see. Compatibility, so having similar values and beliefs, similar goals, and also by social support. So having someone that you can turn to in a time of difficulty. Romantic relationships in adolescence are affected quite a bit by parental attachment style. So if you remember, we talked about the different secure and insecure avoidance, all those different attachment styles we talked about in, early childhood maybe. Those, you start to really see the effects of those in these romantic relationships. So people will often mimic kind of the attachment style they inherited from their parents in these romantic relationships. So someone who was securely attached in early childhood is going to have the best outcomes in their romantic relationships. They're going to respect each other's boundaries. They're going to share a deep intimacy. They're going to respect each other, have good communication, etc. Those who have the insecure attachment style are going to have worse outcomes. They may not respect each other's boundaries. They may not have good communication, etc. Cultural expectations can also play a huge part in the development of romantic relationships at this time. You guys are probably all aware certain cultures are much stricter about whether or not you should even be dating in the first place and who you should be dating. So that can all play a huge part in the development of romantic relationships as well. Okay, so last slide, talk a little bit about the change of moods and emotions that happen during adolescence. I mentioned this briefly when we talked about hormones and all the hormonal changes, because that has a huge impact on moods and emotions. So as these sex hormones and growth hormones become more dominant and more, there's a higher number basically within the body, that has a lot of effects on emotions and moods. And overall, I would say it basically just pushes moods to the extremes. So, we talked about how they're more likely to engage in this risk-taking behavior because rewards seem to have a much higher impact at this time than they do in early childhood or in young adulthood. And so that kind of response to reward can push adolescents to have a very high, elated mood. But then also those hormones can trigger these, periods of essentially depression. So in adolescence, you get this mix of moods that can sometimes almost look like a bipolar disorder of sorts. And in fact, I would say mood disorders often will show up most commonly in adolescence. So someone who is going to be bipolar, for example, is most likely to get a diagnosis or at least start showing signs and symptoms in adolescence. Same with things like major depressive disorder. So depression and other mood disorders become common. About 15 to 20% of adolescents will have some kind of mood disorder episode during this time. So that could be a depressive episode. It could be like a manic episode where they're euphoric, basically like the opposite of depression. There tend to be some pretty large gender differences. So girls are about twice as likely to suffer from depression than boys during this time and also through the rest of the lifespan. One of the tricky things with adolescents is that they often do not receive treatment for these different disorders, and that might partly be because parents sort of expect that, oh, you're going to have all these hormonal changes and that's going to trigger your mood. And so it's just like a phase that you're going through. And so teenagers who are suffering from true like clinical depression or bipolar disorder might not be diagnosed because their parents are sort of ignoring it and thinking that it's just like normal hormonal changes. If it's allowed to continue untreated, obviously that can lead to all kinds of issues. It can lead to reduced academic achievement, poor like social relationships, poor hygiene and physical health, and at the extreme end can also lead to suicidal thoughts and attempts of suicide. Let's see, let me jump ahead to my notes on that. So I said girls are much more likely to be depressed. They're about twice as likely to suffer from depression. Despite that, boys are much more likely to attempt and succeed at suicide. That's partially due to like the different methods that boys and girls attempt. Boys tend to use methods that are more effective and less likely to fail, compared to girls tend to use methods that are more likely to fail, or they're more likely to take time to where someone could potentially find them and stop them, or help them, essentially. Let's see, suicide rates jump at adolescence. So this is, compared to middle childhood, it becomes much more common and much more likely. And unfortunately, rates of suicide in adolescence have gone up pretty drastically over the past few years. I think during COVID too, that like exacerbated a lot of things and made it even worse. Some of the kind of things that can help prevent or respond to suicide. One is just attending to warning signs and taking them seriously. So if anyone is ever talking about, committing suicide, it's always important to take those seriously, to not just assume that like they're doing it for attention or something like that, and to try to direct them to get help or get help for them. Obviously being, like a support person, if there's a friend or someone who is going through a depressive time, being there to support them can also help prevent. There's quite a bit of evidence that like gun control legislation can also limit suicide rates. And it's also very important, obviously, if anyone has been talking about suicide or has attempted it, that they get some sort of treatment. Typically, antidepressant medications or therapy are going to help pretty drastically in reducing the rates of suicide. And then it's also important, if there has been a suicide or attempted suicide within like a friend group or a school, to monitor those who are close to them, because oftentimes you can have sort of like, domino effects where one person takes their life and then their friends and the people around them are obviously grieving and depressed, and that can lead to more suicides down the road. So monitoring those around them afterwards is also really important. Okay, sorry to end on such a down note, but that was my last slide for today. Any questions about social and emotional development in adolescence?